The screams do not last long. They never do. By the time the sun rises over Jerusalem, the streets are already slick, the air thick with smoke, iron, and prayer spoken in a dozen accents. Men kneel in blood they did not expect to wade through. Others stand stunned, hands shaking, unable to remember when killing became this easy. Inside sacred spaces that had stood for centuries, bodies lie where worshippers once pressed their foreheads to stone. This is victory, they are told. This is God's will. And yet, even here, at the very height of triumph, something feels irreversibly broken. How did it come to this point, where a holy city becomes a graveyard and salvation is measured in corpses? By the end of that summer, tens of thousands are dead. Not soldiers alone, but families, elders, children who never carried weapons. Chroniclers on both sides describe the same scene with different words, yet none soften it. Horses stumble through streets clogged with bodies. Survivors hide among the dead, holding their breath as boots pass inches from their faces. One account claims blood ran ankle-deep, another insists it reached the knees. Exaggeration, perhaps, but only because language fails when human cruelty outpaces imagination. This was not an accident. It was not chaos. It was the result of years of promises, fears, and hunger sharpened into steel. Thousands of miles away, men who would never see Jerusalem again had already paid the price. Entire villages in Europe lost their working-age men to a journey most would not survive. Some never reached the Holy Land at all, dying instead of thirst within sight of rivers or of disease in camps where prayers were louder than medicine. Many crusaders sold everything they owned for the chance to walk a road they barely understood. Some mortgaged land to monasteries, unknowingly reshaping European economics for generations. Few were told that most crusaders would not return home alive. Fewer still were told that those who did return often came back ruined, haunted, or quietly ashamed. The idea that this was a clean war of faith collapses quickly under the weight of reality. Before Jerusalem ever fell, entire Jewish communities along the Rhine were massacred by crusaders who decided the enemy was closer than promised. Some bishops tried to shelter them. Some failed. Some did nothing. These killings were not ordered by Rome, yet they were carried out by men convinced heaven would forgive them. This was a rehearsal for what Jerusalem would become. Even the city itself had already changed hands many times before the Crusaders arrived. For centuries, Jerusalem had been ruled by empires that tolerated multiple faiths, sometimes uneasily, sometimes pragmatically. Pilgrims of different religions prayed in overlapping spaces, watched by soldiers more concerned with taxes than theology. The city was holy, yes, but it was also a functioning place with markets, homes, and routines that had little to do with prophecy. The Crusaders did not see that city. They saw a symbol. And symbols, once weaponized, rarely survive intact. What makes this moment so unsettling is how ordinary the men involved were. These were not professional soldiers, raised from birth for slaughter. Many were farmers who had never killed before. Knights trained for combat, yes, but even they were accustomed to ransoms and negotiations, not annihilation. Yet belief can compress moral distance faster than any command. When you are told that killing cleanses the soul instead of staining it, restraint becomes a liability. Some crusaders wept as they killed, others sang hymns. A few wrote letters home describing the events with pride, unaware that centuries later their words would unsettle historians rather than inspire them. And still, this was not the end of the story. It was the midpoint disguised as a climax, because Jerusalem would fall again, and again. And each time, the memory of this moment would echo, shaping how enemies imagined one another long after the blood had dried. The cost was not limited to the dead. The survivors carried something heavier. Muslim chroniclers described the shock of encountering warfare without limits, where surrender offered no protection. Christian chroniclers, writing years later, struggle to reconcile the brutality with the faith they believed guided them. Some insist miracles occurred. Others quietly stop writing altogether. One lesser-known account speaks of a knight who wandered the city afterward, no longer carrying his sword, unable to speak. Another describes a cleric who spent days washing blood from church floors, only to realize it would never truly come out of the stone. These moments rarely make it into popular retellings, yet they reveal something essential. Even those who believed themselves righteous were changed by what they had done. The Crusades were not a single war, nor a unified movement. They were a series of eruptions driven by fear of loss, hunger for land, desperation for meaning, and genuine religious devotion tangled together so tightly that even participants could not separate them. Some sought salvation, others sought escape from debt. Younger sons with no inheritance saw opportunity where their elders saw ruin, and all of it converged here, in this city, at this moment, where faith and violence finally collided without restraint. From this point forward, history fractures. In Europe, returning crusaders would be treated as heroes, even when broken. Their stories would reshape literature, law, and the idea of holy war itself. In the Islamic world, the memory of Jerusalem's fall would not fade into myth, but harden into warning. Trust would evaporate. Diplomacy would become cautious, edged with memory. The irony is that this victory planted the seeds of its own undoing. The brutality that secured Jerusalem also unified those who would one day take it back. The Crusader states born from this moment would be fragile, overstretched, dependent on constant reinforcements that grew harder to justify with each passing decade. Standing at this climax, it becomes clear that the Crusades were never just about a city. They were about how fear travels faster than understanding, how belief can be shaped into both comfort and weapon, and how ordinary people can be carried into extraordinary violence without ever fully realizing when they crossed the line. If this was the moment everything seemed decided, what long chain of choices, sermons, and silent compromises led humanity here in the first place? Long before swords were raised beneath Jerusalem's walls, long before banners stitched with crosses fluttered in desert winds, the world that would give birth to the Crusades was already restless, already strained at its seams. In the villages of Western Europe, life was short and narrow. Most people never travelled farther than a day's walk from where they were born. Their world was measured in seasons, harvests, and the moods of local lords. Hunger was not a rare disaster but a recurring visitor. A single bad harvest could erase years of fragile stability. Disease moved faster than understanding, and prayer often filled the gap where medicine failed. Faith was not a private matter. It structured time itself. Bells marked the hours, saints' days replaced calendars. Heaven and hell were not abstract ideas, but looming destinations discussed as casually as tomorrow's weather. To live was to wait, and to wait was to endure. Suffering was not only expected, it was explained. Pain meant meaning. Hardship meant testing. For the younger sons of noble families, life carried a different kind of confinement. Land passed to eldest heirs. The rest inherited swords, expectations, and little else. Knighthood offered honor, but also constant violence. Private wars between lords were common, destructive, and often pointless. The church tried repeatedly to restrain this chaos, declaring certain days holy and forbidding combat during them. These attempts rarely worked. Violence was embedded too deeply to be paused by sermons alone. Yet even as Europe struggled inwardly, stories flowed eastward. Merchants, pilgrims, and returning travelers spoke of lands beyond imagination, cities where spices perfumed the air, markets filled with silks and glassware that seemed almost magical, and at the center of these stories stood Jerusalem, not merely a city, but a symbol shaped by centuries of scripture, retold so often that its physical reality barely mattered anymore. For many, Jerusalem was not a place on a map, it was an idea, hovering somewhere between heaven and earth. Pilgrimage had long been a part of Christian devotion. Even before the Crusades, thousands attempted the journey each year. Some returned with relics and stories. Many did not return at all. Yet the road remained open more often than later, memory admits. Under Muslim rule, Christian pilgrims were usually allowed access, taxed rather than barred. The city changed hands between empires, but it did not exist in a permanent state of war. That nuance would later be lost. To the east, the Islamic world was not a single unified force, despite how it would later be portrayed. It was fragmented, diverse, and often internally divided. Caliphates rose and fell. Local rulers competed for power. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo were centers of learning unmatched in Europe at the time. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy flourished there, preserved and expanded, while much of Europe struggled to hold on to the remnants of Roman knowledge. Trade connected these worlds more than warfare did. European goods flowed east, Eastern ideas flowed west. Coins minted in Islamic lands circulated in Christian markets. Yet understanding lagged behind exchange. Each side knew the other mostly through rumor, filtered through fear and faith. Then came a shift. In the Eastern Mediterranean, new powers emerged. The Seljuk Turks expanded rapidly, defeating the Byzantine Empire in a devastating battle that shattered imperial confidence. Byzantine territory shrank. Roads once considered safe became dangerous. Pilgrimage grew more uncertain, though not impossible. Reports reached Europe colored by anxiety and exaggeration. Each retelling sharpened the sense of loss. The Byzantine emperor, ruling from Constantinople, watched his world contract. His armies were weakened, his borders strained. For centuries, Byzantium had been the shield between Western Europe and the powers of the East. Now that shield cracked. When the emperor sent appeals westward for help, he did not ask for holy war. He asked for mercenaries, for soldiers to stabilize borders, for assistance within familiar political norms. What he received would be something else entirely. Back in Europe, the church stood at a crossroads. Papal authority was growing but not secure. Kings challenged it, emperors disputed its reach. Reform movements sought to purify clergy who had grown wealthy and corrupt. The papacy needed a unifying cause, something larger than local disputes, something that could bind Christendom together under a single sacred goal. Jerusalem offered that possibility. At the same time, ordinary people were searching for escape. Life promised little beyond repetition and suffering. The idea that one journey, one act of devotion, could erase a lifetime of sin was intoxicating. The promise was not subtle. Participate, and your soul would be cleansed. Not eventually, but immediately. Heaven would no longer be an uncertainty, but a guarantee. For some, this was salvation. For others, it was opportunity disguised as holiness. Landless knights saw potential estates. Peasants saw freedom from debts that bound them to soil and lord alike. Criminals saw absolution without consequence. Even women joined, not as passive followers, but as participants who cooked, healed, traveled, and sometimes fought. Entire families sold everything they owned for the chance to walk eastward together, believing the road itself was sacred. Yet almost no one truly understood where they were going. Maps were crude, distances were guessed, climate was imagined rather than known. Many believed Jerusalem lay only weeks away. Few comprehended deserts, unfamiliar diseases, or the political complexities of the lands they would cross. The world beyond Europe was flattened into a single idea: enemy territory. This misunderstanding was not accidental. It was cultivated. Sermons emphasized suffering Christians, desecrated holy sites, and enemies portrayed as cruel caricatures. The reality was far more complex, but complexity rarely moves crowds. Fear does, hope does. And when the two combine, reason often steps aside. What is striking is how little it took to push this fragile world into motion. Not an invasion of Europe, not the closure of pilgrimage routes, but stories, requests, promises spoken aloud before massive crowds who had never been addressed as part of something larger than their village. Once spoken, those words could not be taken back. The world before the Crusades was not peaceful. It was violent, unequal, and deeply anxious. But it was also interconnected, trading, negotiating, coexisting more often than later legends suggest. The Crusades would not create conflict from nothing. They would magnify existing tensions until they consumed generations. Standing at this moment, before banners were raised and vows sworn, history feels poised on the edge of something immense. A world shaped by hunger, faith, fear, and longing waits for a spark powerful enough to turn movement into momentum. And when that spark finally comes, who truly understands what they are about to unleash? The moment arrives not with thunder, but with a voice carried across a cold open field. It is late autumn, and the crowd has gathered tighter than planned. Farmers stand beside armored men. Clerics rub their hands against the chill. No one here expects to witness history. They expect another council, another series of debates that will drift back to Rome and disappear into parchment. Instead, they hear something that will follow them for the rest of their lives. The Pope does not shout at first. He speaks of loss, of lands once Christian now ruled by others, of pilgrims harassed, taxed, humiliated, sometimes killed. He speaks of brothers in the East calling for aid, their churches silent, their bells torn down. Each image is chosen carefully, not because it is entirely false, but because it is incomplete, the truth, flattened just enough to fit into a sermon. Then the promise comes, not wealth, not land, forgiveness. Every sin wiped clean, every burden lifted. A lifetime of guilt erased not through years of penance, but through a single act of devotion. Take the cross, go east, God will know your name. For many listening, this is the first time faith feels active rather than endured. Not a slow suffering meant to earn heaven someday, but a decisive moment that changes everything at once. You can almost feel the shift ripple through the crowd. Men glance at their hands as if they already hold swords. Others imagine themselves returning home transformed, their past no longer able to follow them. Someone cries out, then others. The words are not scripted, but they spread instantly, as if waiting to be spoken. God wills it. God wills it. The Pope pauses. He allows the sound to grow. He does not need to command anymore. The decision has already been made for him. What follows is one of the greatest mobilizations in medieval history, and it begins with almost no preparation. Across Europe, preachers repeat the message. Some are authorized, many are not. One wandering monk, gaunt and barefoot, becomes more influential than any bishop. He speaks plainly, without polish, promising salvation to the poor as readily as to knights. Crowds weep openly as he speaks. Entire villages take vows together, convinced delay itself is sinful. Cloth crosses are sewn onto tunics, cloaks, even children's clothing. They are worn proudly, but also dangerously. Taking the cross becomes a public declaration, one that binds the wearer socially as much as spiritually. To abandon the journey later is not just failure, it is betrayal. Few pause to ask how they will eat. Even fewer ask who will die. The Church issues guidelines, but they are vague. Go when ready. Arm yourselves as you can. Trust that God will provide. For an institution accustomed to slow, hierarchical control, what unfolds is astonishing. Tens of thousands move without central leadership. There is no unified army, no supply chain, no clear plan beyond direction. East. Some groups leave immediately. They cannot wait. The world feels urgent now, compressed. To hesitate is to risk losing divine favor. These early bands include men, women, and children traveling with little more than faith and rumors. They believe the journey itself will protect them. They are wrong. Along the way, hunger sets in quickly. Markets cannot absorb so many travelers at once. Local populations grow fearful. Fights break out over food. Promised charity turns into resentment. Disease spreads through camps that move too slowly to outrun it. And then, the violence turns inward. In cities along the Rhine, Crusaders encounter Jewish communities who have lived there for generations. Neighbors, traders, people they have known all their lives. Someone asks a question that should never have been asked aloud. Why fight enemies far away when enemies of Christ live among us? The answer, once spoken, becomes action. Synagogues are attacked. Families are dragged from homes. Some are given the choice of conversion or death. Some choose neither and take their own lives. Local bishops attempt intervention, hiding people in palaces and churches. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. These massacres are not ordered by the Pope, they are condemned after the fact. But condemnation does not bring the dead back, and the message is clear to those watching. The crusade is not just a journey, it is permission. By the time the official armies begin to assemble, entire communities have already been erased. The nobles, who eventually lead the crusade, are more organized, but not more unified. Each brings his own men, his own goals, his own grudges. They swear oaths to one another, but these are fragile promises, strained by hunger and pride. Cooperation exists, but it is brittle. When they reach Byzantine lands, the gap between expectation and reality widens further. The Byzantine Empire is Christian, but not in the way Western crusaders recognize. Language, ritual, dress, and politics feel foreign. The emperor greets the leaders with caution, not gratitude. He demands oaths that captured lands be returned to him. Some agree, some lie. Crusaders interpret this caution as treachery. Byzantines interpret crusader behavior as dangerous and unpredictable. Both are correct. The emperor ferries them across the Bosporus as quickly as possible, not out of generosity, but relief. He wants them gone from his capital before something irreversible happens. Once across, the Crusaders enter lands shaped by climates and tactics they do not understand. Their enemies do not fight as expected. Battles are not formal clashes of heavy cavalry on open fields. They are ambushes, skirmishes, arrows fired from distances that feel cowardly to knights trained for face-to-face combat. Crusaders respond with fury rather than adaptation. Losses mount. Still, victories come. Cities fall. Siege warfare, brutal and slow, favors numbers and persistence. When a city is taken, discipline often collapses. Loot replaces restraint. Civilians suffer. Each success convinces the Crusaders that God approves, even when the cost is staggering. The belief that divine favor explains survival becomes self-reinforcing. If you live, God protected you. If you die, God called you home. There is no outcome that challenges the premise. Behind the armies, the church begins to realize what it has unleashed. Attempts are made to reassert control, to standardize leadership, to remind participants of limits. These efforts arrive too late. The crusade now moves under its own momentum, driven by vows that cannot be quietly withdrawn. Letters begin to return westward. Some describe miracles, others beg for reinforcements. Some speak of suffering so severe that it sounds like exaggeration, until multiple accounts align. Families at home receive word that sons have died without burial, without confession, without even knowing where they were. And yet, more people take the cross. What makes this moment so unsettling is how quickly sacred language reshapes moral boundaries. Killing becomes service. Theft becomes provision. Obedience to leaders becomes secondary to obedience to perceived divine will. When disagreements arise, each side claims God's endorsement. This is not unique to the Crusades, but the scale is unprecedented. Within a few years, the idea of holy war has been normalized in Western Christian thought, not as metaphor, but as physical obligation. Future generations will inherit this framework without remembering how radical it once was. They will assume it has always been there. But here, at its beginning, the uncertainty is palpable. Leaders argue, soldiers doubt, preachers reassure. Everyone pushes forward, afraid that stopping might reveal questions they no longer know how to answer. The road east stretches longer than promised. The enemy is more human than expected. The price is already far higher than imagined. As the Crusaders march on, convinced that redemption waits just beyond the horizon, one question remains unspoken but unavoidable. What happens when a promise of salvation collides with the reality of endless war, and neither is willing to yield? By the time the crusading armies truly leave familiar ground behind, the road itself has become their first enemy. The march east is not a single column moving with purpose, but a scattering of forces stretched across months and miles. Some travel too quickly and outrun their supplies. Others move so slowly that disease overtakes them before battle ever does. What unites them is exhaustion. Feet blister and rot inside boots, never meant for such distances. Armor, once a symbol of protection, becomes a burden under unfamiliar heat. Water decides who lives and who does not. Rivers marked on crude maps turn out to be seasonal trickles. Wells are fouled or already drained by earlier groups. Men trained to fight cannot negotiate thirst. Horses collapse first, their deaths crippling entire units that depend on cavalry. Knights who once imagined themselves as invincible warriors now walk beside peasants, humbled by the same hunger. Food becomes obsession. Grain is seized. Livestock disappears overnight. Villages along the route learn to fear the sound of approaching banners. Some flee before the Crusaders arrive. Others stay and attempt trade, only to be overwhelmed by numbers too large to manage peacefully. Violence flares not because it is ordered, but because desperation is contagious. Discipline erodes quietly. Leaders issue commands, but they compete with hunger, fear, and the belief that divine purpose excuses disobedience. When a soldier believes God has called him personally, a general's authority feels negotiable. Punishments are inconsistent. Mercy is rare. Survival becomes the only rule everyone agrees on. When the armies reach Asia Minor, the land itself feels hostile. Heat presses down during the day. Cold seeps in at night. The terrain refuses familiarity. Forests give way to open plains where enemies can watch from a distance, invisible until arrows fall without warning. Crusaders trained for shock combat find themselves powerless against skirmishers who never stand still long enough to be charged. Panic spreads faster than tactics. There are moments of triumph. A city surrenders. A fortress falls. Each victory restores morale briefly, convincing survivors that suffering has meaning. But for every success, there are setbacks, quietly buried in letters home or left unrecorded entirely. Units vanish between camps. Stragglers are captured or killed without witnesses. Entire groups simply stop appearing in chronicles, absorbed by the road. Not all suffering comes from enemies. Infighting grows common. Disputes over leadership, loot, and blame fracture already fragile alliances. Accusations of betrayal circulate easily. A shortage of food can turn allies into rivals overnight. Oaths, sworn in Europe, weaken under pressure they were never tested against. Women and children on the march endure hardships rarely acknowledged in official accounts. Some die from exposure or disease. Others are sold into servitude when groups can no longer support them. A few survive by adapting quickly, trading skills for protection, navigating danger with quiet resilience. Their stories survive only in fragments, glimpsed between lines written by men who rarely noticed them. The psychological toll deepens. Crusaders begin to see enemies everywhere. Locals become potential threats. Silence feels suspicious. Mercy feels risky. Each ambush reinforces the idea that restraint equals weakness. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the threshold for violence lowers. What once required justification now feels necessary. When they encounter cities held by Muslims, negotiations sometimes occur. Terms are discussed, hostages exchanged. For brief moments, the war resembles politics rather than apocalypse. But these moments are fragile. One betrayal, real or imagined, can erase months of restraint in a single afternoon. Religion does not fade during this suffering. It intensifies. Processions are held before battles, relics are carried into combat, fasting continues even when food is already scarce. When victory comes, it is proof of divine favor. When defeat follows, it is proof of insufficient faith. The logic tightens until there is no room left for doubt. Some crusaders begin to question quietly. Letters mention confusion, regret, longing for home. But these doubts rarely spread openly. To question the journey is to question its promise, and to question the promise is to risk everything already sacrificed. The further east they travel, the more irreversible the journey becomes. Turning back is not just shameful, it is dangerous. Roots behind them are stripped bare. Former allies have moved on. Home feels impossibly distant, not just in miles, but in identity. The person who left no longer exists. Only the crusader remains. By the time the armies approach the Levant, they are no longer the same people who first took the cross. Hunger has reshaped them. Loss has hardened them. Belief has narrowed their vision. Compassion survives, but it flickers. Overwhelmed by survival instincts sharpened by months of attrition. They have not yet reached Jerusalem, but already the war has claimed more lives than most medieval battles ever would. And still, the promise pulls them forward, whispering that all this suffering will make sense once the holy city finally appears on the horizon. But when a journey transforms people long before its destination is reached, what kind of arrival can possibly justify the road that led there? Before the first stones are hurled, and before the walls begin to crack, there is a pause that history rarely lingers on. If you are listening now, Having stayed with this story through hunger, fear, and endless roads, take a quiet moment to support this channel if you have not already. These stories take time, research, and care to tell. Without that support, this channel cannot survive, and without it, we stop making content like this. Now, let us return to the world as it was, balanced on the edge of violence. The city of Antioch rises from the plain like a challenge. Its walls are vast, reinforced by towers that follow the curve of the hills. For the Crusaders, Antioch is not just another obstacle. It is a test of whether everything they have endured has meaning. If this city cannot be taken, Jerusalem itself becomes an illusion. Siege warfare begins not with heroics, but with waiting. Days stretch into weeks, weeks blur into months. The Crusaders encircle the city, but their numbers are too few to seal it completely. Supplies slip through gaps. Morale erodes as slowly as stone under rain. Food becomes scarce again, repeating a familiar pattern that now feels cruelly inevitable. Horses die first, then dogs, then rats. Chroniclers describe men fighting over scraps that would once have been fed to animals without thought. Leather straps are boiled until they soften enough to chew. Even then, they offer little nourishment. Hunger sharpens tempers and dulls judgment. Leadership fractures under pressure. Commanders argue openly, accusing one another of cowardice or ambition. Each believes his interpretation of God's will is the correct one. Unity exists more in sermons than in practice. The crusade, once imagined as a single sacred body, reveals itself as a fragile coalition held together by exhaustion and fear of failure. Inside Antioch, the situation is no less desperate. The city is crowded with civilians who had no voice in the decisions that led here. Food is rationed, prices soar beyond reason. Families sell possessions, then heirlooms, then dignity, simply to survive another week. Rumors circulate constantly. Relief armies are coming. No, they have been defeated. No, they are already at the gates. Each rumor reshapes hope and despair without warning. Trust inside the city frays as well. Leaders fear betrayal. Neighbors watch one another too closely. Doors are barred earlier each night. The sense of enclosure becomes suffocating. Antioch is strong, but strength feels useless when time itself turns against you. Outside the walls, the Crusaders face a different enemy. Disease spreads through camps where sanitation is impossible. Dysentery weakens men who were already malnourished. Fevers carry off those who survived ambushes and battles. Death becomes ordinary, no longer marked by ceremony. Bodies are buried hastily, sometimes not at all. The ground around the camp grows crowded with shallow graves. Some begin to slip away. Desertion is rarely dramatic. A man fails to appear at morning prayers. Another does not return from gathering firewood. Each absence is noted, then absorbed into the routine of loss. Those who remain tell themselves that deserters were unworthy anyway. It is easier than admitting how tempting escape has become. Then, unexpectedly, the city falls. Not through overwhelming force, but through betrayal, negotiation, and desperation woven together. A gate is opened in the night. Crusaders pour in, fighting through narrow streets still half asleep. Resistance collapses unevenly, block by block. By dawn, Antioch is theirs. Relief should follow. It does not. Almost immediately, word arrives that a massive enemy army is approaching. The Crusaders are trapped inside the city they have just taken. The roles reverse. Now they are the besieged. Hunger returns faster than before. The surrounding countryside is stripped bare. Escape routes are cut off. Panic flares openly. Some leaders flee the city in shame, abandoning men who trusted them. Others stay and attempt to hold together what remains of authority. Morale collapses. It is in this moment, when despair feels complete, that belief resurges in its most dangerous form. A relic is discovered. A holy lance, said to have pierced the side of Christ. Its discovery comes at exactly the moment when faith is failing. Skeptics exist, but their voices are drowned out by need. The object does not need to be genuine. It only needs to be believed. Processions fill the streets. Fasting resumes despite starvation. Confession becomes constant. Men who had begun to doubt now cling harder than ever. If suffering has meaning, then survival must be proof. The Crusaders launch a desperate attack against the besieging army. Against all expectations, it succeeds. Whether through enemy miscalculation, internal divisions, or sheer recklessness, the enemy withdraws. Antioch remains in Crusader hands. The victory feels miraculous precisely because it should not have happened. Once again, survival is interpreted as divine endorsement, but this victory carries a hidden cost. The idea that God rewards persistence regardless of method becomes deeply ingrained. If starvation, betrayal, and slaughter lead to success, then they are no longer regrettable necessities. They are tools. From Antioch to Jerusalem, the journey continues, but the Crusaders are changed. They are no longer simply pilgrims with swords. They are veterans of siege and starvation. They have learned that mercy is optional and that hesitation can be fatal. When Jerusalem finally appears on the horizon, it feels unreal. Men fall to their knees. Some weep openly. Others are silent, unsure how to process arrival after so much loss. The city is smaller than imagined, its walls less grand than Antioch's, but its meaning is heavier. The siege of Jerusalem is swift by comparison, but no less brutal. Siege towers are constructed from timber dragged across barren ground. Attacks are launched repeatedly, repelled again and again. Heat presses down, water runs low, bodies accumulate near the walls, reminders of how little margin remains. When the city finally falls, restraint evaporates. What follows is not a battle, but a purge. Soldiers sweep through streets, killing without discrimination. Sacred spaces offer no protection. Those who surrender are cut down alongside those who resist. Chroniclers struggle to describe what they witness. Some attempt justification. Others record events plainly, perhaps believing the facts speak loudly enough on their own. It is here that the crusade reaches its most infamous moment, the one that will be remembered long after tactical victories fade. The killing is not ordered in a single command. It happens because no one stops it, because the men involved have spent years learning that survival equals righteousness. When the violence finally slows, exhaustion replaces fury. Crusaders walk through the aftermath stunned by what they have done. Some kneel in prayer amid bodies, others loot silently. A few wander aimlessly, unable to reconcile the holiness they were promised with the reality beneath their feet. Victory has been achieved. The vow is fulfilled. Now comes the part no one prepared for. Jerusalem must be governed. Food must be distributed. Defenses must be maintained. The city must function. The Crusaders, trained for war and penance, are suddenly administrators in a land they do not understand. Who owns what? Who rules whom? Who pays taxes? Who is protected? These questions expose deep divisions. Some leaders claim titles. Others resist. The population left alive remembers the conquest vividly. Trust does not exist. Cooperation is forced, fragile, and temporary. Beyond Jerusalem, news spreads quickly. In Europe, victory is celebrated. Sermons praise God's will fulfilled. Songs are written. Returning crusaders are treated as heroes, even when broken in body and mind. The darker details fade into whispers. In the Islamic world, the fall of Jerusalem is not forgotten. It is recorded, mourned, and remembered with clarity. It becomes a wound passed down through generations, shaping how future leaders interpret threats and opportunities alike. The Crusaders believe they have ended a chapter. In truth, they have written a beginning. The success of this campaign ensures it will not be the last. It proves that holy war can work, that sacrifice can be rewarded, that faith can mobilize armies across continents. It also proves that brutality, once justified, rarely stays contained. As the dust settles and the city tries to breathe again, one unresolved thought hangs over everything achieved here. If the road to holiness required this much blood, what kind of future has just been made possible? And who will be forced to walk that road next? The war does not end when the swords are lowered. It simply changes its shape. After the conquest, the land settles into an uneasy quiet, the kind that follows catastrophe rather than peace. Jerusalem stands scarred but intact, its streets altered not just by damage, but by memory. Outside the city, other territories are claimed. carved into fragile domains that stretch along the eastern Mediterranean. These are not kingdoms born of tradition or consensus. They are experiments in survival, held together by fortifications, fear, and constant vigilance. The Crusader states emerge slowly and awkwardly. Titles are distributed among leaders who never planned to rule. A duke becomes a count. A knight becomes a lord over villages whose language he does not speak. Boundaries are drawn not by geography or culture, but by what can be defended before the next threat arrives. Governance is improvised. European systems of law are transplanted into unfamiliar soil. Feudal obligations are declared in places where feudalism has no roots. Documents are written in Latin for populations who read Arabic, Greek, or not at all. Authority depends less on legitimacy than on proximity to armed men, yet life does not stop. Markets reopen because people must eat. Farmers return to fields because survival demands routine. Trade resumes across religious lines, not because trust has been restored, but because commerce is more stubborn than ideology. Muslim merchants sell grain to Christian lords who once fought their neighbors. Eastern Christians navigate a new hierarchy that views them as both allies and outsiders. Daily life becomes a careful negotiation. Crusaders quickly discover that ruling requires compromise. They rely on local administrators who understand irrigation, taxation, and trade routes better than any newcomer could. Interpreters become indispensable. Alliances form quietly, often contradicting the language of holy war still preached in churches. Some lords learn quickly. They adopt local customs, wear lighter clothing, eat unfamiliar foods, and listen more than they command. Others refuse adaptation entirely, insisting that dominance alone will maintain control. These differences matter. Territories ruled with flexibility survive longer than those governed by rigidity. Fortresses rise across the landscape. Stone castles, crown hills, and guard roads, projecting strength in a land where numbers are always thin. These fortifications are not just military tools. They are symbols meant to reassure settlers and intimidate enemies. Inside their walls, European families attempt to recreate familiar lives, importing habits from home into a climate and culture that resist imitation. Women play a critical role in this fragile stability. They manage estates while husbands campaign. They negotiate marriages that bind alliances. They oversee households that include servants, locals, and sometimes former enemies. Their work rarely appears in chronicles, yet without it, the Crusader states would collapse far sooner. Not all interactions are hostile. Shared dangers create unexpected cooperation. Raiding bands threaten everyone equally. Drought does not discriminate by faith. In some towns, Christian and Muslim residents agree informally to protect one another's livelihoods. These arrangements are practical rather than idealistic, born from necessity rather than reconciliation, yet tension never fully recedes. The memory of conquest lingers in every interaction. Muslim communities live under restrictions, taxed differently, monitored closely. Some convert outwardly to survive. Others leave, relocating to regions where life feels less precarious. Those who remain learn to read subtle signals, to avoid confrontation, to endure quietly. Eastern Christians face their own dilemma. They share a faith with the rulers, but not a tradition. Differences in ritual and theology that once coexisted become sources of suspicion. Some are favored, others are marginalized. The unity, imagined by Crusade rhetoric, dissolves into familiar hierarchies of power. Meanwhile, the Crusaders themselves struggle with identity. Many expected to return home after fulfilling their vows. Instead, they find themselves tied to land and responsibility. Returning west means abandoning everything gained, while staying means living permanently at the edge of danger. Reinforcements arrive sporadically, often inexperienced and burdened by the same misconceptions as the first wave. The population remains small, isolated, and dependent on constant support from Europe. Letters are sent westward, asking for men, money, and supplies. Some are answered. Many are ignored as enthusiasm fades. The idea of crusade remains powerful, but the reality of sustaining distant territories is far less appealing than the promise of spiritual reward. Over time, the language of holy war begins to clash with lived reality. Local truces are made with Muslim leaders to ensure stability. Trade agreements flourish. Shared enemies shift alliances unexpectedly. These compromises are necessary, but they feel uncomfortable to those who still imagine the conflict as absolute. This tension shapes the culture of the Crusader states. They become places where identities blur. Children grow up speaking multiple languages. Clothing reflects a blend of styles. Architecture combines European fortifications with Eastern techniques. The land reshapes those who settle in it, whether they admit it or not. Not everyone adapts. Some Crusaders cling fiercely to separation, isolating themselves within castles and enclaves. They view compromise as weakness and coexistence as betrayal. Their territories often suffer first when conflict returns, their inflexibility leaving them vulnerable. Beyond the borders, the Muslim world watches carefully. The initial shock of Jerusalem's fall gives way to reassessment. Leaders study their enemy rather than dismiss them. They note the Crusaders' strengths and, more importantly, their weaknesses. Fragmentation, reliance on distant support, internal rivalries. These observations will matter later. Within the Crusader states, power struggles intensify. Succession disputes erupt when leaders die without clear heirs. Factions form. Assassinations occur quietly. The ideals that once unified the crusade give way to familiar political maneuvering. The land does not care about vows taken years earlier. Religion remains central, but it evolves. Churches are built, pilgrimage resumes under new management, relics attract visitors and revenue. Faith becomes institutional rather than explosive, structured rather than urgent. For settlers born in the East, the crusade is not a memory, but an environment, yet the sense of impermanence never disappears. Every decision is made with the awareness that enemies surround these territories. Every harvest could be interrupted. Every alliance could dissolve. The Crusader states exist in a state of suspended tension, neither fully at war nor at peace. This constant pressure shapes behavior. Laws become harsher, punishments more public. Authority relies on visible strength. Fear becomes a tool of governance, not because rulers desire cruelty, but because they believe leniency invites collapse. And still, life continues. Children are born, marriages celebrated, stories told by firelight. Ordinary moments persist amid uncertainty, reminding us that history is not lived as a series of dramatic events, but as days strung together by necessity. The Crusader states are often remembered only as outposts of conquest, but they are also laboratories of coexistence, adaptation, and contradiction. They reveal how ideology bends under daily reality, and how survival often requires abandoning absolutes. Yet this fragile balance cannot last forever. Beyond the horizon, new leaders are rising. Memories of loss harden into resolve. Unity begins to form where fragmentation once ruled. The land itself seems to sense the coming shift. As the Crusader states settle into routines built on compromise and vigilance, one unresolved question shadows every wall and market. Can a society born from conquest ever truly belong to the land it occupies? Or is it always living on borrowed time? The balance does not break all at once. It tightens first, slowly, almost politely, until every movement feels watched and every decision feels consequential. Beyond the borders of the Crusader states, the Muslim world is changing. The shock of Jerusalem's fall has settled into something more durable than grief. It becomes memory. Memory becomes motivation. Leaders who once competed with one another begin to understand that division was the true enemy all along. The Crusaders are not unbeatable. They are few, isolated, and dependent on a sea that can be cut. Out of this realization emerges patience. In cities like Damascus and Cairo, scholars, soldiers, and administrators debate strategy rather than revenge. The lesson drawn from earlier failures is not to rush westward in fury, but to consolidate, to stabilize, to wait. Where the Crusaders rely on constant reinforcements, their opponents can rely on continuity. This difference will matter. One man comes to embody this shift. Saladin does not rise as a conqueror at first. He appears as an administrator, a servant to stronger figures, watching carefully. He learns how power functions, how loyalty is earned, and how mercy can be wielded as effectively as fear. He understands that brutality alone creates resistance, but restraint can create legitimacy. His rise is gradual, almost unremarkable to those who expect history to announce itself loudly. When Saladin eventually takes control of Egypt, he inherits wealth, infrastructure, and a population accustomed to governance. He uses these tools not to launch immediate war, but to strengthen foundations. Armies are trained, fortifications repaired, supply lines secured. He does not frame his leadership as a personal ambition, but as a restoration of order and dignity. Crucially, he understands the symbolic power of Jerusalem. To reclaim it is not only a military goal, but a moral one. Yet he also understands that timing matters more than passion. He watches the Crusader states fracture internally, their leaders squabbling, their alliances strained by ego and inheritance disputes. While the Crusaders argue over titles, Saladin builds coalitions. He presents himself not as a tyrant, but as a unifier. He emphasizes justice, religious legitimacy, and protection of the faithful. His reputation spreads deliberately. Stories circulate of his discipline, his restraint, his refusal to indulge in excess. These stories matter as much as his victories. They draw support without coercion. Within the Crusader states, the change is sensed, but misunderstood. Raids increase. Border skirmishes grow bolder. Caravans are attacked with greater coordination. Messages from Europe arrive less frequently. Reinforcements thin. The initial fire that launched the First Crusade has cooled into routine concern. Some Crusader leaders recognize the danger. They attempt diplomacy, negotiating truces and exchanges. Others dismiss the threat, convinced that God's favor will intervene as it has before. This confidence, once a source of strength, now becomes a liability. When conflict escalates, it does so decisively. Saladin avoids the mistakes of earlier commanders. He refuses to be drawn into unfavorable terrain. He denies the Crusaders access to water, a lesson learned painfully well. He controls movement rather than rushing into confrontation. The land becomes a weapon in his hands. The decisive moment comes not at Jerusalem, but at Hattin. The Crusader army marches under the weight of its own arrogance, lured into dry ground during the height of summer. Water is scarce, discipline frays quickly, heat breaks men faster than enemy blades. Saladin's forces encircle patiently, cutting off retreat, harassing without committing fully. When the battle finally breaks, it is less a clash than a collapse. Crusader formations disintegrate. Knights charge desperately, only to find themselves isolated and overwhelmed. Infantry scatter. The relic of the true cross, carried as a symbol of divine protection, is captured. The psychological blow is immense. For many, it feels like abandonment. After the battle, Saladin faces a choice. He could repeat the brutality of Jerusalem's earlier conquest. He could make an example that history would never forget. Instead, he chooses something different. Prisoners are treated with relative restraint. Ransoms are accepted. Executions are limited to specific figures seen as threats, not indiscriminate slaughter. This decision is strategic as much as moral. By contrasting his behavior with that of the Crusaders decades earlier, Saladin reshapes the narrative. He presents himself not as a destroyer, but as a restorer of balance. The comparison spreads quickly. Reputation becomes momentum. When Jerusalem falls again, the difference is stark. The city is surrendered after negotiation. Civilians are allowed to leave. Ransoms are set at rates many can afford. Those who cannot are often freed anyway. Sacred sites are protected. The Dome of the Rock is cleansed and reopened, not in fury, but ceremony. This restraint does not erase the pain of loss for Christians, but it changes how the event is remembered. In Europe, the shock is profound. Jerusalem was supposed to be permanent. Its loss forces a reckoning. Sermons shift tone. Where once victory was proof of God's will, now defeat demands explanation. Some argue sin has returned. Others claim complacency. A few begin to question the entire framework that promised certainty in exchange for violence. Yet the response is familiar. Another crusade is called. The cycle repeats, though never with the same innocence or enthusiasm. Subsequent crusades grow more political, more fractured, and often more misguided. Some never reach the Holy Land at all. Others turn against fellow Christians, sacking cities that were never part of the original vow. The idea of crusade survives, but its soul is altered. Back in the Levant, Saladin's victory does not end conflict, but it reshapes it. The Muslim world gains confidence. Unity, once rare, becomes achievable. The Crusader states shrink, clinging to coastlines and fortresses, their days clearly numbered. Yet even Saladin cannot escape the limits of mortality. After his death, the unity he forged begins to fray. His successors struggle to maintain cohesion. Old rivalries resurface. History reminds everyone that individuals matter, but structures matter more. Still, something irreversible has happened. The myth of Crusader invincibility is broken. The belief that holy war guarantees success is no longer unquestioned. Both sides now understand that faith alone does not decide outcomes. Strategy, patience, and restraint matter just as much. For ordinary people, the consequences are mixed. Some cities recover, trade resumes, cultural exchange continues quietly beneath the noise of war. Others suffer repeated sieges, their populations worn down by conflicts they never chose. The land bears the scars long after banners are lowered. The Crusades, once framed as a clear struggle between belief systems, reveal themselves instead as a long negotiation between power and meaning. They reshape identities, not just borders. They teach future generations how easily righteousness can justify destruction and how difficult it is to reclaim humanity once lines are crossed. As Jerusalem changes hands once more, and as the memory of earlier massacres contrasts with later restraint, one unresolved thought lingers across centuries. If history remembers victories and defeats differently depending on who holds the pen, how much of what we believe about the past is shaped not by what happened, but by how restraint and cruelty chose their moments? The later Crusades do not arrive like a storm. They come like echoes, weaker in force yet louder in consequence, repeating ideas that once felt sacred, but now sound strained, distorted by time and disappointment. In Europe, the loss of Jerusalem does not extinguish the idea of crusade. It hardens it. What was once a promise of salvation becomes a test of loyalty. To doubt the crusade now is to doubt centuries of sacrifice already made. Too much blood has been spilled to question the premise openly, yet something has shifted. The people who hear new calls to arms are not the same as those who heard the first. They have inherited stories rather than hope. They know fathers who never returned. They know lands mortgaged and never reclaimed. They know relics that promised protection and failed. The certainty that once propelled entire villages eastward now competes with fatigue. The church adapts its language. Crusades are no longer framed solely around Jerusalem. They are redirected, redefined, expanded. Enemies are identified closer to home: heretics, political rivals, Christians who do not submit to the same authority. The logic of holy war, once unleashed, proves flexible enough to be repurposed again and again. This flexibility is dangerous. When crusading armies march against fellow Christians, the moral clarity promised at the beginning collapses completely. The sack of Constantinople stands as one of the most revealing moments of this transformation. A city that had stood for centuries, a center of Christian learning and faith, is attacked not by external enemies, but by those who claim to defend Christendom itself. The violence is staggering. Churches are looted, relics shattered or sold, civilians slaughtered, sacred spaces desecrated by men who once swore to protect them. Chroniclers struggle to justify what unfolds. Some blame greed, others blame poor leadership. Few dare to say the obvious. The crusade has turned inward. For Byzantium, this moment is catastrophic. The empire never truly recovers. Its wealth is drained, its defenses weakened, its trust in Western allies destroyed. When new threats arise later, the scars of betrayal still ache. What was framed as a detour becomes a turning point in the collapse of a civilization. Meanwhile, crusades continue elsewhere. In Iberia, wars against Muslim kingdoms are folded into the crusading framework. In the Baltic, campaigns are launched against pagan populations who have never threatened Rome or Jerusalem. Conversion is enforced through violence, baptisms performed at sword point. Survival becomes indistinguishable from faith. These wars are quieter than those in the Levant, but no less consequential. Entire cultures are erased or transformed, Languages disappear. Belief systems collapse under pressure. Survivors adapt outwardly while carrying older traditions in secret. The crusade becomes a tool of expansion rather than defense, a justification rather than a response. For those who participate, the experience is different now. Veterans return, not with awe, but with bitterness. Promised rewards shrink. Political realities intrude. The church struggles to maintain credibility as crusades fail more often than they succeed. Each defeat requires explanation, and explanations grow thinner with repetition. Some crusaders begin to recognize the pattern. They see that leaders benefit more than soldiers, that land and titles go to a few while graves multiply for the many, that salvation, once promised freely, now feels conditional, deferred, uncertain. Yet the idea persists because it has become institutional. Crusading orders like the Templars and Hospitallers rise in prominence. They blend monastic discipline with military force, creating organizations that outlast individual campaigns. These orders manage wealth, land, and networks across Europe and the Mediterranean. They are efficient, disciplined, and deeply entwined with politics. For a time, they embody the original ideal better than anyone else. But success breeds suspicion. Their wealth attracts envy. Their independence threatens kings. Accusations surface. Heresy, corruption, secret rites, whether true or fabricated, matters less than utility. When political need aligns with moral panic, even sacred institutions can be destroyed. The fall of the Templars is swift and merciless. Arrests occur overnight. Confessions are extracted under torture. Assets are seized. An order once revered becomes a cautionary tale. The message is clear. Holy war serves power. But power does not serve holy war indefinitely. In the Islamic world, the later Crusades are met with less shock and more calculation. Jerusalem's importance remains, but it is no longer the sole focus. Trade, diplomacy, and regional stability matter more than symbolic victories alone. Leaders negotiate when advantageous and fight when necessary. The Crusaders are treated as one factor among many, not an existential anomaly. This pragmatism contrasts sharply with European rhetoric. While sermons still invoke cosmic struggle, reality demands compromise. Treaties are signed, hostages exchanged, intermarriage occurs quietly among elites. The world refuses to conform to absolutes. For ordinary people caught between these shifting priorities, life remains precarious. Cities are fortified and refortified. Taxes rise to fund campaigns that never arrive or fail spectacularly. Young men are pulled into wars whose purpose feels increasingly abstract. The language of faith masks the language of exhaustion. Even the concept of pilgrimage changes. Travel to holy sites continues, but under negotiated protections rather than crusading fervor. The idea that holiness requires violence loses its monopoly. Alternative expressions of devotion emerge, quieter and more inward. Mysticism grows. Reform movements question corruption. Universities debate theology rather than simply enforce it. The intellectual world begins to stretch beyond the framework that birthed the Crusades. Slowly, almost invisibly, the age of crusade begins to fade, not because it is renounced, but because it becomes unsustainable. The economic cost is too high, the political returns too uncertain, the moral clarity too compromised. By the time the final Crusader strongholds fall along the coast, their loss barely registers beyond regional concern. Europe has moved on to other conflicts. New ambitions replace old vows. The Holy Land becomes one interest among many, no longer the axis of salvation it once was. Yet the legacy remains. The Crusades leave behind hardened borders of memory. Distrust between cultures deepens. Stories of betrayal and brutality outlive those who experience them. Each side remembers different moments, emphasizes different wounds. Perhaps most enduring is the lesson learned by institutions. That belief can mobilize masses. That suffering can be framed as purpose. That once a moral exception is granted, it can be expanded far beyond its original intent. These lessons do not vanish with the end of crusading armies. They are studied, adapted, and reused in different forms across centuries. As the banners finally fall and the last vows dissolve into history, one unresolved question remains, quieter now, but no less heavy. When a society builds its sense of righteousness on the idea of sacred violence, how long does it take before that violence forgets what it was meant to serve? The aftermath of the Crusades stretches across decades, centuries even, but the world does not pause to reflect. Life continues, reshaped, though scarred, in ways that remain invisible to those who live it daily. Cities rebuild, populations recover, and trade resumes, yet nothing is the same. The memory of conquest lingers in streets, markets, and households, subtle as dust in sunbeams, shaping behavior in ways even survivors cannot articulate. Crusader families attempt to create new homes in the East, but the land resists them as much as their enemies. Houses are rebuilt from stone, salvaged from ruined walls. Fields are replanted, but irrigation knowledge is uneven. Locals who survived conquest watch cautiously, negotiating coexistence as best they can. Trust is scarce. Suspicion has become routine. Every interaction, every transaction, carries the unspoken memory of violence. European settlers adapt in their own ways. Clothing, food, and customs merge with local practices. The blending is often practical. Lighter robes for the heat, new crops for survival, alliances with neighbors for protection. Even architecture evolves. Towers built in European styles incorporate Eastern techniques to withstand sieges and local climate. Children born in these lands grow up speaking multiple languages, often unaware that the world of their parents was different, less complicated, and far more violent. The Church attempts to maintain authority, but its influence has shifted. Crusading rhetoric persists in sermons and texts, but the realities of governing, defending, and living in foreign lands dilute its impact. Bishops and preachers continue to encourage devotion, but they also must address logistics, governance, and diplomacy tasks their counterparts in Europe rarely considered. Pilgrimages are restructured, often under negotiated protections rather than fervent zeal, signaling the transformation of holy war into managed devotion. Trade flourishes despite tension. Markets reopen because people must eat, and commerce is more resilient than ideology. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish merchants negotiate and barter, creating networks that are fragile yet surprisingly persistent. Goods travel, money flows, and a semblance of normal life returns. Survival becomes the unifying principle, sometimes overriding faith, sometimes blending seamlessly with it. Yet tension never fully dissipates. The memory of conquest persists among local populations. Muslim communities continue to live under restrictions and scrutiny, while some outwardly convert to Christianity to survive. Eastern Christians, sharing faith but not tradition with the European rulers, navigate a delicate line between loyalty and self-preservation. Conflicts erupt periodically, small yet brutal reminders that the region remains contested. Crusader military orders, such as the Templars and Hospitallers, rise in this environment. They combine monastic discipline with military expertise, creating organizations that endure beyond individual campaigns. These orders manage wealth, land, and influence across Europe and the Mediterranean. Initially, they embody the ideal of organized, disciplined holy warriors, yet their wealth and independence attract suspicion, envy, and eventually persecution. The fall of the Templars exemplifies how quickly institutions once revered can be destroyed when political necessity aligns with moral panic. Meanwhile, the Muslim world is learning from experience. Leaders like Saladin have demonstrated that patience, strategy, and legitimacy can be more effective than brute force alone. Knowledge accumulated over decades of the Crusaders' strengths and weaknesses allows for more calculated responses in subsequent conflicts. Political stability and diplomacy, rather than mere retaliation, become tools as important as armies and fortresses. In Europe, successive crusades increasingly lack the focus and unity of the First Crusade. Calls to arms still emerge, but enthusiasm is tempered by experience. Later campaigns are often fragmented, politically motivated, or mismanaged. Some never reach the Holy Land at all, while others turn against fellow Christians, exemplified by the sack of Constantinople. Such events reveal the moral flexibility and dangers inherent in the crusading ideal. Once sanctified violence is possible, it becomes easier to redirect against any target deemed appropriate. Across generations, the cultural and social consequences of the Crusades continue to unfold. Knowledge, ideas, and technologies are exchanged, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident. Architecture, agricultural techniques, medical knowledge, and military innovations traverse the Mediterranean, blending East and West in ways that neither could have anticipated. Yet alongside these gains remain enduring scars, mistrust, religious tension, and the memory of atrocities. The Crusades also shape European identity in profound ways. The idea that faith can mobilize armies, sanction violence, and justify suffering becomes embedded in political and religious thought. Moral lessons are derived, codified, and passed down, even when the original context is forgotten. Societies learn how belief can serve power, and how power can bend belief to its own ends. Yet for those who lived through the campaigns, the lessons are immediate and deeply personal. Every survivor carries both pride and trauma. Every city, village, and fortress is a testament to endurance and resilience, but also to the fragility of human life in a world defined by conflict. Generations remember not just victories, but the cost at which they came. Stories circulate, sometimes glorified, sometimes hushed, embedding memory into culture and consciousness. Ultimately, the Crusades reveal a paradox. The desire to create certainty through holy war inevitably produces uncertainty, instability, and unintended consequences. The lessons are both strategic and moral. Victories achieved through violence are temporary, if not sustained by governance, diplomacy, and cultural understanding. Zeal, without reflection, leads to excess and, often, tragedy. And human societies, once exposed to the normalization of sanctioned violence, are forever changed. As the last Crusader strongholds along the coast fade from European attention, and as both East and West move toward new conflicts, one unresolved question persists. If belief and righteousness can mobilize entire populations to extraordinary feats, what happens when those forces are misapplied, and who ultimately pays the price for promises that exceeded human capacity? The fall of the last Crusader strongholds does not feel like an ending. Instead, it marks the beginning of a prolonged aftermath, a period where the consequences of years of conflict ripple through generations, reshaping societies, economies, and cultures across the Mediterranean and Europe. The coastal cities, once thriving outposts of European presence, now shrink into fortified enclaves, their walls filled with memories of battles fought, lives lost, and promises broken. Survivors cling to routines built during the long occupation. Markets reopen, churches function, families attempt to rebuild normality, but nothing is untouched by the shadow of the Crusades. Trade resumes cautiously, a mixture of necessity and opportunity driving interactions between former enemies. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish merchants rebuild networks that stretch from the Levant to the heart of Europe. Goods flow, currencies circulate, and knowledge travels alongside commerce. Ships carrying spices, textiles, and manuscripts cross the Mediterranean with new vigilance, aware that the seas can bring both profit and danger. Trade becomes the lifeblood that sustains fragile cities, but also a subtle reminder of the delicate balance achieved after years of violent upheaval. Settlers and administrators from Europe, who once imagined the Levant as a permanent extension of Christendom, gradually learned to adapt to the realities of the region. Architecture evolves as a practical response to climate and warfare. European-style towers incorporate Eastern techniques, thick walls rise against sieges, and water systems are improved for survival in a land often hostile to newcomers. Clothing, food, and social customs merge with local practices, creating a hybrid culture born of necessity. Children born in these lands grow up speaking multiple languages, often unaware of the violent history that shaped their environment. Yet the memory of conquest remains omnipresent. For local Muslim populations, the scars of loss and occupation dictate daily life. Communities navigate restrictions, monitor the intentions of rulers, and preserve traditions quietly under the watchful eyes of European lords. Some outwardly convert to Christianity for survival, while secretly maintaining their own beliefs. Eastern Christians face their own complexities, caught between loyalty to European rulers and adherence to their own faith traditions. Suspicion lingers, and the daily negotiation of coexistence becomes an unspoken skill passed down across generations. The Crusader military orders, such as the Templars and Hospitallers, rise to prominence during this period, shaping both military and economic structures. They manage wealth, estates, and fortifications across Europe and the Mediterranean, demonstrating discipline and organization unmatched by local forces. Initially seen as ideal instruments of holy war, these orders eventually attract scrutiny and envy. Their growing independence and wealth provoke accusations, ranging from heresy to secret conspiracies. The dramatic downfall of the Templars, arrests, torture, and executions illustrates how institutions, no matter how sanctified, can be destroyed when political ambition aligns with perceived moral failure. Meanwhile, the Muslim world consolidates its understanding of the Crusader threat. Leaders like Saladin have demonstrated the power of strategic patience and political legitimacy over brute force. Subsequent rulers study the Crusaders' strengths and weaknesses, learning that disciplined governance and coordinated alliances often outweigh the impulsive zeal of religious warfare. Jerusalem remains symbolic, yet its practical importance is measured alongside regional stability, trade, and diplomacy. Strategy, patience, and negotiation become tools as vital as armies, fortifications, and holy vows. In Europe, successive crusades reflect the lessons learned, but also the dangers inherent in repeating past mistakes. Later campaigns are often politically motivated, fragmented, or poorly executed. Some never reach the Holy Land, while others redirect violence against fellow Christians, as seen in the sack of Constantinople. These events reveal the malleability of the crusading ideal. Once violence is sanctified in the name of faith, it can be redirected toward almost any target deemed necessary. The moral framework of the First Crusade begins to unravel, leaving room for opportunism, corruption, and political intrigue. For ordinary people, the consequences are immediate and personal. Communities endure repeated raids, fluctuating taxes, and social upheaval. Farmers, craftsmen, and merchants navigate a landscape where survival requires both resilience and adaptability. Families teach children to read subtle signals in behavior and intention, to recognize threats in routine interactions, and to endure hardship quietly. Cultural and technological exchange continues despite these pressures. Eastern knowledge of irrigation, medicine, architecture, and navigation is absorbed, adapted, and transmitted back to Europe, influencing societies far beyond the Levant. The Crusades also leave a profound imprint on European identity. They demonstrate how belief can mobilize populations, justify extraordinary actions, and normalize violence in the pursuit of a perceived moral imperative. Soldiers and settlers learn that survival requires flexibility, strategic thinking, and sometimes compromise. Religious leaders learn that rhetoric alone cannot sustain campaigns, and that practical governance demands attention to economics, logistics, and diplomacy. These lessons, once internalized, shape political thought, military strategy, and religious practice for generations. Yet, for the regions directly affected, the consequences are enduring and often tragic. Entire communities are displaced, languages shift or vanish, and cultural traditions are altered or lost. Memory preserves both trauma and resilience, ensuring that the stories of conquest, survival, and adaptation continue to influence identity and politics. These narratives are neither uniform nor universally accepted. Perspectives differ depending on which side of the battle, wall, or city gate one stood. Intellectually and spiritually, the Crusades provoke reflection and reform. Mystical movements grow in response to disillusionment with institutional authority. Scholarly debates flourish in universities, exploring theology, law, and history. Pilgrimage persists, but is increasingly regulated and protected, rather than undertaken with blind zeal. Faith evolves alongside experience, becoming both an internal guide and a framework for understanding a world that has been profoundly destabilized. The long-term impact of the Crusades is also visible in the development of military and political structures. Fortresses and city walls constructed during the campaigns endure, influencing future defensive architecture. Strategic thinking, logistics, and the integration of multinational forces are refined through trial and error. Crusading orders leave a legacy of disciplined organization, resource management, and administrative expertise that survives even after their political and religious relevance wanes. Ultimately, the Crusades illustrate a central paradox. The pursuit of certainty through sanctioned violence inevitably produces uncertainty, instability, and unintended consequences. Victory, once achieved, is fleeting unless reinforced by governance, diplomacy, and cultural understanding. Zeal, without reflection, breeds excess, trauma, and cycles of revenge. And societies that normalize violence, even for sacred purposes, are forever changed in their perception of morality, authority, and human cost. The land itself, scarred by decades of occupation and warfare, serves as a constant reminder. Hills are dotted with ruined towers. Fields bear the remnants of abandoned settlements. Trade routes recall the ebb and flow of armies, merchants, and refugees. Memory inhabits not only stories and chronicles, but also the very soil that witnessed the rise and fall of conquerors. The physical and cultural landscapes become intertwined, each shaping the other in ways that persist long after the banners have fallen. As Europe turns to new conflicts, and the Levant adjusts to new rulers, one enduring question emerges, quietly haunting both victors and survivors. If belief in righteousness can mobilize entire populations to extraordinary feats, what happens when those forces are misapplied, and who ultimately bears the cost of promises that exceeded human capacity?